Look at the person sitting to your left. Now look at the person to your right. Statistically, one of them is running a behavioral loop right now designed to manage your perception of them. But you already knew that, didn't you? You felt the slight shift in the room's atmospheric pressure when they walked in. You noticed the micro-expression of contempt that flashed across their face for exactly 1/25th of a second before they pasted on a social smile. For years, you've been told that this trait, this hyper-acute sensitivity to human behavior, is a flaw. You've been told you're too sensitive, that you absorb too much energy, that you need to protect your fragile peace. You've been conditioned to view your primary neurological asset as a liability. That narrative ends today. What they call oversensitivity is actually an uncalibrated, high-resolution behavioral tracking system. You are not a fragile instrument designed to break under the weight of the world's darkness. You are an apex observer who has simply been reading the data wrong. You have been allowing the targets of your observation to dictate your emotional state. Right now, in this exact moment, a tectonic shift is happening in your psychological architecture. The phase of isolation, of recovering from narcissistic drainage, of hiding away to heal, that phase is officially closed. You are about to enter the single biggest comeback of your life. But this isn't a comeback built on positive affirmations or soft boundaries. This is a tactical evolution. In the next few minutes, I am going to hand you the exact behavioral metrics required to flip the leverage in every single room you walk into. I am going to show you the precise mechanics of how a highly empathetic brain, once decoupled from the need for external validation, becomes the most lethal psychological force in the room. If you leave this room early, if you look away, you will miss the specific behavioral sequence that stops predators in their tracks. The exact sequence that turns you from the hunted into the one who dictates the entire psychological landscape. Stay with me, because by the end of this speech, the people who used to exploit your empathy will look into your eyes and realize they are dealing with an entirely different predator. We need to establish a hard baseline truth right now. You have never been weak. When we analyze the mechanics of influence and human deception, we look for individuals who possess an innate capacity to read the unspoken. Most people are behaviorally blind. They wander through life reacting only to what people say. But you see the hidden architecture. You hear the cadence of a lie before the sentence even finishes. The problem wasn't that you were weak. The problem was an error in your internal wiring. You mistook your ability to read human suffering for an obligation to fix it. When a predator, a narcissist, a master manipulator, a compliance engineer, looks at an uncalibrated empath, they don't see a victim. They see a nuclear power plant with no security guards. They see an infinite reservoir of attention, validation, and emotional resonance. They anchor into your biology by exploiting your natural desire for connection. They created behavioral loops, push and pull, praise and punishment, until your nervous system became addicted to their stability. But an anchor only works if the ship stays still. Your comeback does not begin when you forgive them. Your comeback begins when you calibrate your data. From this moment on, we are separating empathy from emotional compliance. Empathy is a data gathering tool. It is radar. When your radar picks up a threat, a lie, or an incoming wave of manipulation, your historical response was to internalize it. What did I do wrong? How can I fix this atmosphere? The calibrated response is entirely clinical. You observe the data, you categorize it, and you remain entirely detached. Imagine walking into a room and seeing someone trying to manipulate you. Instead of feeling your chest tighten, you watch their pupils dilate. You notice their vocal pitch rise. You observe the artificiality of their gestures. You don't get angry, you get analytical. The moment you view a manipulator through the lens of behavioral profiling, they lose 100% of their power over your central nervous system. They cease to be a threat and become a case study. This is the largest comeback of your life because the dynamic is officially reversing. For years, you have been on the defensive. You've been hiding, setting boundaries that you secretly hoped people wouldn't cross, and praying for peace. But real sovereignty isn't asking people to treat you well. Real sovereignty is making it behaviorally expensive for them to treat you poorly. When a healed, calibrated empath steps back into the world, they possess an unfair advantage. You have survived the worst of psychological warfare, which means your threshold for chaotic behavior is incredibly high. But now, you are pairing that resilience with absolute tactical clarity. When you look at the people who used to exploit you, you will not see giants. You will see fragile, predictable algorithms running old, tired code. You will see that their cruelty was never a sign of power. It was a desperate, clumsy attempt to mask their own structural flaws. First, you switch off the broadcast. Manipulators feed on your reactions. If they can make you cry, make you defensive, or make you over-explain yourself, they win. From this second forward, you offer them absolute behavioral stillness. When they attempt to trigger you, you give them a flat, unreadable expression. You let their manipulation hang in the air, unacknowledged, until the silence forces them to choke on it. Second, you weaponize your focus. Instead of using your hyper-awareness to anticipate their needs, you use it to map their weaknesses. You notice what makes them insecure. You observe where their masks are slipping. You don't use this to hurt them. You use it to let them know, with a single, steady glance, that you see right through them. There is nothing more terrifying to a fraud than an observer who cannot be fooled. The world is starved for genuine authority, and true authority belongs to those who can see reality clearly without being corrupted by it. Your isolation is over. Your period of recovery is complete. You are not entering the room to blend in, and you are certainly not entering it to be liked. You are entering the room to command the psychological space. Let the manipulators keep running their petty, transparent loops. Let them try their old tricks. The next time they approach you, they won't find the soft, yielding target they remember. They will run headfirst into a brick wall of absolute behavioral discernment. Stand up. Fix your gaze. The biggest comeback of your life doesn't start tomorrow. It starts the very next time you look a manipulator in the eye and let them realize, without you saying a single word, that their power over you has just evolved into absolute zero. We need to dismantle a massive cultural lie right now, and we need to do it with clinical precision. For your entire life, the narrative surrounding the concept of an empath has been drenched in weakness. You have been handed a script written by people who wanted you soft, pliable, and easily managed. They told you that your empathy was a fragile spiritual burden, a beautiful flaw that meant you were destined to absorb the toxic emotional waste of every room you walked into. You were taught to view yourself as a walking sponge, defenseless against the moods, the hidden rage, and the psychological currents of the people around you. This is an absolute error in your psychological architecture, and the very first step of your comeback requires a brutal, uncompromising recalibration of how you define your own mind. What you have been calling oversensitivity, or a curse, is, from a behavioral profiling perspective, a high-resolution, uncalibrated data gathering system. Your brain simply possesses a hyper-acute neurological radar. Where the average person walks into a room behaviorally blind, noticing only the explicit words spoken, your system is processing hundreds of microscopic data points every second. You are registering the subtle micro-expressions that flash across a face for less than a fifth of a second. You are tracking the minute changes in vocal pitch, the microscopic shifts in physical posture, the tension in a person's jaw, and the subtle, unconscious breathing patterns that reveal their true internal state. Your brain is a supercomputer designed for elite-level behavioral tracking. The problem has never been the data your radar was picking up. The problem was what you did with that data the moment it entered your system. Historically, because your system was uncalibrated, you allowed a catastrophic error to occur. You mistook data for an obligation. The second your radar picked up an atmospheric shift, a ripple of hidden anger, an undercurrent of tension, or the hollow resonance of a narcissist's masked insecurity, your old behavioral loop kicked in. You instantly internalized it. You assumed the emotional weight of that data belonged to you. You asked yourself, "What did I do wrong?" Or, "How do I fix this atmosphere?" This single error is the exact backdoor that every predator, manipulator, and compliance engineer has ever used to gain leverage over your life. They anchor into your biology by feeding your uncalibrated system chaotic data, knowing that your immediate reaction will be to over-explain, overcompensate, and drain your own psychological reserves to stabilize the room. The baseline shift means that from this exact second, the sponge is dead. You are no longer absorbing the room, you are mapping it. You are transitioning from passive emotional absorption to active clinical observation. When your radar picks up a threat, an inconsistency, or a toxic emotional frequency, you do not let it drop into your chest. You hold it out in front of you. You look at it through the lens of a behavioral profiler. When someone attempts to project their chaos onto you, you don't feel it. You categorize it. You observe their pupils dilate. You notice the artificiality of their gestures. You analyze their desperate need for control as a predictable behavioral algorithm running old, broken code. The moment you shift your internal posture from, "How do I fix this?" to, "Look at what this person is revealing about themselves right now," the entire power dynamic flips. You stop being the target of the psychological environment, and you become the one who profiles it. To truly weaponize your comeback, we have to look directly at the anatomy of the trap you've been caught in for years. Master manipulators, corporate compliance engines, and narcissistic predators do not operate at random. They are behavioral engineers, and they rely on a highly specific, repeatable architecture of exploitation to capture your psychological real estate. They don't target your weaknesses. They target your strengths, specifically your hyper-acute awareness of human emotion and your deep-seated desire to create harmony. A predator scans a room looking for the person who is most attuned to the emotional atmosphere, because they know that individual possesses the exact neurological leverage they need to build an ideological prison. The exploitation architecture begins with a phase of hyper-calibration, often masked as intense affection or intellectual alignment. The manipulator studies your baseline behavior. They watch what makes your eyes light up. They note your deepest insecurities, and they map out the exact phrases that trigger your empathy. Once they have this data, they begin the process of anchoring. They create an artificial psychological feedback loop where they alternate between intense validation and sudden, unexplained withdrawal. Because your brain is wired to track connection, the sudden withdrawal acts as a massive neurochemical shock. Your system registers this drop in connection as an immediate threat, forcing you into a hypervigilant state where 100% of your cognitive bandwidth is dedicated to reading their moods and anticipating their next move. You become a hostage to their internal weather, constantly adjusting your behavior to avoid the next storm. This is the exact point where they introduce the weaponized loop of cognitive dissonance. They treat you with casual cruelty or subtle contempt, but they do it with a smile, or they gaslight you into believing your high-resolution observation is actually paranoia. Your brain, which clearly registered the micro-expression of hostility, is forced to battle against their spoken word. This creates a state of internal psychological paralysis. You begin to doubt your own radar. You stop trusting your eyes and start trusting their script. The moment you accept their narrative over your own direct observation, the leverage completely flips. You have handed over the keys to your psychological sovereignty. They no longer have to work to manipulate you. You are now actively manipulating yourself on their behalf, editing your thoughts, suppressing your boundaries, and managing your behavior to keep them comfortable. But this entire architecture relies on one critical vulnerability. It requires you to stay blind to the blueprint. The absolute second you step back and see the machinery for what it is, the leverage collapses instantly. The comeback begins the moment you recognize that their chaotic behavior isn't a sign of complex emotional depth. It is a cheap, predictable sequence designed to elicit a specific compliance reaction. When they pull away to make you chase them, or when they drop a passive-aggressive comment to make you defend yourself, you stop reacting to the content of their words and start pointing your focus at the intent of their mechanics. You look at their manipulation not as a personal assault, but as a desperate, clumsy attempt by a fragile ego to maintain control. You watch the loop play out in real time without offering a single drop of emotional resonance, turning their psychological trap into a glass cage where they are completely exposed. The transition from a passive collector of emotional data to an elite behavioral observer requires the immediate deployment of weaponized discernment. For decades, your radar has been running in the background, collecting millions of data points on human deception, insecurity, and manipulation. But you have been forbidden from using that data to protect yourself. Society has trained you to polite yourself into compliance, to look away from anomalies, and to ignore the flashing red warning lights in your gut for the sake of social etiquette. Weaponized discernment means the politeness protocol is officially terminated. From this moment on, you do not talk yourself out of what your eyes are seeing. You do not edit your reality to make a manipulator feel safe. You treat every single human interaction with the clinical detachment of a behavioral profiler, turning your natural empathy into a high-powered lens that strips away every mask in the room. To execute weaponized discernment, you must learn to read humanity not by what they project, but by the leaks in their behavioral baseline. Every single human being runs a default baseline of vocal tone, gesture speed, and facial movement when they are comfortable. The moment someone with deceptive intent enters your space, their baseline will fracture. You must train your focus away from the macro narrative, the flattering words, the grandiose promises, the rehearsed charm, and lock on to the micro signals. You look for the microscopic asymmetry in a smile that reveals genuine contempt. You track the sudden, sharp intake of breath before a difficult question is answered, signaling an immediate fight or flight response in their nervous system. You notice the rigid, frozen posture of someone who is over-controlling their body language because they know they are running a fraudulent script. These are not guesses. They are physical, biological leaks that a manipulator cannot suppress. When you weaponize your discernment, you stop being a participant in their psychological game and you become the referee. When a narcissist or a toxic manipulator attempts to run an exploitation loop on you, they depend entirely on your willingness to play along with the illusion. They need you to accept the fake persona they have constructed. Weaponized discernment shatters this dynamic because you refuse to validate the fraud. When they tell a manipulative lie or attempt to shift blame onto you, you don't engage in an argument, you don't offer defensive counter-arguments, and you certainly don't get emotional. Instead, you look directly at the point of fracture. You let your gaze lock onto their eyes with absolute, unblinking stillness. You let them see that you have detected the micro-expression, that you have noted the shift in their vocal pitch, and that you are currently measuring the distance between their words and their actual behavior. This level of discernment is weaponized because it leaves the manipulator entirely naked in the environment. A predator thrives in the fog. They rely on your confusion, your self-doubt, and your willingness to give them the benefit of the doubt. When you clear the fog and look at them with cold, analytical clarity, they experience a profound psychological shock. They realize instantly that their standard algorithms of charm and guilt have hit a wall of absolute zero. They see that you are tracking their behavioral metrics in real time, decoding their hidden architecture with every word they speak. You have shifted from the person who absorbs the damage to the person who maps the threat, rendering their entire arsenal of manipulation completely useless against the sophisticated architecture of your newly calibrated mind. We need to redefine the entire concept of boundaries because the traditional advice you've been given is completely broken. You've been told that setting boundaries means building walls, screaming your worth from the rooftops, or engaging in exhausting confrontations where you demand that people respect your limits. That isn't sovereignty, that is a defensive reaction, and to a master manipulator, a loud boundary is just a challenge. It lets them know exactly where your pain points are and where they need to apply pressure to break you. The sovereignty protocol is something entirely different. It is not about building an emotional fortress to keep the world out. It is about fundamentally altering your internal behavioral matrix so that manipulative tactics simply fail to achieve compliance. It is the transition from a fragile defensive posture to an absolute, unshakable state of psychological immunity where toxic behavior cannot even find a foothold in your reality. The core of the sovereignty protocol lies in the total elimination of your behavioral reactivity. Manipulators, narcissists, and compliance engineers feed on reaction. Your emotional response is the currency they use to transact in your life. If they can make you angry, if they can make you defensive, if they can force you to over-explain yourself or beg for their understanding, they have successfully anchored into your nervous system. The sovereignty protocol cuts the power lines to that anchor. From this moment forward, when a manipulator attempts to drop a toxic payload into your space, you respond with absolute behavioral stillness. You do not flinch, you do not explain, and you do not defend. If someone drops a passive-aggressive insult or attempts to gaslight your reality, you let the statement hang in the air between you like a dead weight. You look at them with a flat, unreadable expression, offering zero emotional resonance, zero facial feedback, and zero verbal validation, until the sheer weight of the silence forces them to choke on their own manipulation. This protocol works because it exploits the manipulator's deepest psychological vulnerability, their desperate need for control and feedback. A predator in the social landscape operates like a hacker testing a firewall. They send out small, subtle probes, a minor boundary violation, a slight insult, a brief testing of your compliance, to see how your system responds. If your system flags it with anxiety, anger, or a desire to please, the hacker knows they have found an exploit. But when they run their script against the sovereignty protocol, they hit a wall of absolute zero. They get nothing back. No anger to fight against, no sadness to exploit, no confusion to manipulate. Your absolute calm completely deauthorizes their tactics, leaving them behaviorally paralyzed because their entire playbook requires your active emotional participation to function. By executing this protocol, you are reclaiming your cognitive bandwidth and establishing an unwritten law in your environment. It is now incredibly expensive to mistreat you. You no longer negotiate for respect, and you no longer issue warnings. If a person operates outside the parameters of respect, they lose access to your psychological data. You withdraw your presence, your insight, and your emotional energy, not out of anger, but out of a clinical assessment of their behavioral utility. You become a psychological ghost to them, entirely out of reach, while remaining completely present in your own authority. You are no longer a victim trying to survive the wolves. You have rewritten the code of your own mind so deeply that you have become a completely unhackable system, standing in total, undisturbed sovereignty over your emotional landscape. The final phase of your evolution is the execution of the strategic return, and this is where the leverage flips permanently. For far too long, the narrative surrounding recovery from narcissistic abuse or psychological drainage has been framed as a perpetual state of convalescence. You've been told that after you heal, your only goal is to find a quiet corner of the world, manage your triggers, and live a small, protected life away from the wolves. That is not a comeback. That is a self-imposed exile, and it stops today. Your period of isolation, of hiding away to recalibrate your nervous system, was not a permanent retirement. It was a dark room phase where your new psychological architecture was being forged. You are not returning to the social, professional, or romantic arenas as a fragile, recovering victim, praying that people will treat you gently. You are stepping back into the world as the most behaviorally sophisticated person in every single room you walk into. When you execute the strategic return, you enter environments with an entirely different kind of presence, one defined by absolute stillness and unshakable authority. Most people walk into a room desperate to be liked, validated, or noticed, which makes them highly predictable and incredibly easy to manipulate. They broadcast their insecurities, their needs, and their psychological baselines within the first 5 minutes of conversation. But you? You enter the room completely decoupled from the need for external validation. Because you no longer require the room to tell you who you are entirely free to observe what the room is doing. While everyone else is busy running their social scripts and trying to manage how they are perceived, you are silently mapping the behavioral metrics of the entire environment. You see who is competing for dominant posture, who is leaking insecurity through micro-expressions, and who is attempting to engineer compliance. This gives you an unfair, almost lethal psychological advantage. The very people who used to exploit your empathy, the narcissists, the corporate political actors, the master manipulators, will naturally gravitate toward you, expecting the same soft, yielding target they used to control. But when they run their old, predictable algorithms against you, they will run headfirst into a brick wall of absolute discernment. They will watch you remain entirely unaffected by their charm, completely unbothered by their subtle threats, and totally unresponsive to their guilt trips. You will watch their confusion turn to subtle panic in real time, as they realize their tools no longer work on you. They will look into your eyes and see a level of absolute calm that terrifies them. Because a manipulator knows that someone who cannot be triggered is someone who cannot be managed. Your empathy, once your greatest vulnerability, has now been fully weaponized into your ultimate intelligence system. You are able to navigate complex social hierarchies, toxic work environments, and difficult family dynamics with surgical precision, reading the unsaid and anticipating moves 3 steps ahead of anyone else. You don't use this power to inflict cruelty. You use it to command the psychological space and establish absolute sovereignty.